let's just jump right into it. So hey everybody, it's Garden Sound, and today's episode is going to be a little bit special. I have with me one of my students who has agreed to let me record the session. This is Eli. He's remote. Say hello.
Hello, I'm Eli.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. What we've done is our normal sort of lesson. This is actually the second one we've recorded because I was a Dumbo and didn't back up my data and lost the first lesson, which is kind of a pattern with me in recording things on the internet. But basically, what we've done is we're remote, and the way my lessons work is this was actually his idea. He sent me a couple examples of things that he wants to learn specifically from specific songs. So the other week, we had a conversation via Discord. He said, hey, I want to learn how to make drums just like this. So what I've done is what I normally do. I take these different songs and I create bare bones how to make examples out of each of them using only stock plugins in Ableton. And samples that are easily shareable. Also, shout out to my boy Mr. Bill for providing the majority of the samples in this tutorial. And so basically what my lessons are like is it's a private how to make session. Lasts about an hour. And we talk about whatever's on your mind and just go over, different compositional struggles and go in depth on exactly what you want to learn in a practical manner. And then after this is done, I pack up this project file and I send it to Eli or whomever my student is at the time. And so basically, I'm helping you start a song, and you have this example that you can hold in a folder of examples of lessons where you can say, okay, how do I make that drum sound? Oh, that's right. Gardner and I went over this in a lesson. You can open the project, you can copy the settings, etc. Copy them into an instrument rack, make your own presets. Everything you can do in Ableton, you can do with my lessons. So, all that being said, how you been?
I'm all right.
Yeah?
Kind of just the doldrums of the summer at this point, but
So, how long have you been on break now? It's only been a couple weeks, right?
yeah, it's since the 20th.
Ain't bad. 20th of June?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, literally less than a month. And when do you go back?
August 31st.
Okay. That's nice. You see, in the South, although we get out earlier, right? Because summer for us happens a bit earlier. Dude, we go back like August, like 2nd or 3rd. And so that first month of August in school, I always remember it being like just extremely hot.
Yikes.
Yeah, air conditioners are breaking because nobody was maintaining them over the summer, that sort of thing.
Uh-huh.
But have you been writing? Have you been working on anything?
Yeah, I've had a few different projects I'm working on right now.
Nice. Is there anything special you're working on?
Specials and...
I mean, like, any plans on releasing anything, I suppose?
Nope.
No? Just tinkering?
No. Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, let's jump into the drums from today's lesson. There was a couple of really good examples. You actually chose some stuff that I'm familiar with. I don't know if you meant to do that, but I appreciate it if you did. So what we've got here are, I guess, these two, right? So Madeon and Ninth Parallel are actually pretty similar, and we'll get to why and the different techniques that are used. But Two Door Cinema actually had two very distinct styles of drums in the song, and I want to start off with these because these are pretty cool. I call these natural drums or natty drums, and they're overdriven and EQ'd basically. So if I take off, because by the way, you don't have to do it this way. I'm doing MIDI and I'm sending the MIDI audio to this channel, right? Just to keep it separate. I wanted you to see what the MIDI was like on its own, and then what the effects are that I applied to it.
Sure.
So let me just solo this channel and switch this to auto so we can listen to this on its own. Let's make sure you can hear this too.
I cannot.
Yeah, there's a good reason for that. There we go. I'll turn the channel group on. Let's see if it works now.
Yes.
Is it doing that thing where it cuts out on us?
Nope. Not
No?
this time.
Okay, good. Discord's behaving. Usually I have to go wrangle Discord a little bit. It is on automatically determine input sensitivity, and I'm going to turn that off just for the hell of it. But so that issue shouldn't happen today. Anyway, so these are the natural drums, and it's a pretty basic drum beat. This is just the introduction to that song. I'm not going to play it just so we don't get a copyright flag on this video, but basically standard rock pattern, like boom. Just 3 instruments, right? Three separate sounds: kick, hi-hat, and a snare drum. The interesting thing they are doing, and you'll notice this is up here, and I haven't talked about that yet. This is a very, very soft, open hi-hat. Listen to this. And it really isn't necessarily a hi-hat that they're using. It is a straight up. Could be a ride bell, could be some sort of something, but it's a metallic instrument, right? So it could be even a cowbell, but it's so soft that I can't hear it to determine exactly what instrument it is. But it happens only when the snare drum happens. So whenever you hear barely noticeably on top of it, you get this shimmer of like hi-hats or cymbals ringing in the distance, this. So together, you don't even notice it until I mention it. But let me shrink it down so you can actually look at it. I'm going to play it again for you with this turned off. I'm going to turn it back on now. It makes a slightly noticeable difference. It's that very subtle shimmer on top of the snare drum. So I wasn't actually going to include this in the lesson because obviously I think you wanted to focus on the main drums in the song. But I just thought that was really neat, and it kind of caught my attention. Like, oh man, that's tasteful. I'm going to start doing that. So sometimes I learn stuff while I'm preparing these lessons. But and then so what I've done here is I've sent it through. Let me turn the monitor off. I'm sending it through another channel, and this channel has 3 different settings on it just to give it that characteristic kind of crunched, overdriven sound. And I'm going to turn them off and turn them on one at a time so that we can go over them. Okay, so check this out. And then over time during that intro, all they do is they just increase the frequency on the high cut. So it sounds like this. Although I believe theirs starts off more extremely, so it's more like down here.
Mm-hmm.
Does that sound similar?
Yep.
Cool. So that's basically all that's going on here with the introduction drums. And this is a pretty standard kind of setup for overdriven natural tones. You know who uses this technique a lot, but instead of it being like an introduction or some sort of like, cool aside, it's the featured drums, and that's Trent Reznor, so 9 Inch Nails. All the time they'll be doing like some really extremely distorted drums, and this is a really great setup to do that because they're sort of muffled. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So I'm gonna make this sound like 9 Inch Nails just by manipulating these settings. I'm not gonna add anything to it, okay?
Sure. Sort of similar to that. Did that blow your eardrums out? Nah, I'm good.
I realized I might have been peaking a little bit, but so yeah, that's just a Nine Inch Nails does that a lot, where it's applying a lot of compression, or upward compression, meaning taking the signal and increasing its volume and decreasing the dynamic range at the same time, and applying overdrive, and then like some really harsh EQ curves on where the snare hits and where the kick hits. You know what I'm saying? Like just watching the spectrum as it comes in and just exciting those tones that are already being excited by the drum. So I'm gonna Control Z this all the way back to where it was so that I can preserve the lesson materials. All right, I think that was it. Let me listen to it, make sure I got it right. Yep, that's where we are. Cool. Can I move on?
Yeah. Sweet. Yeah.
All right. So first example done. All right, now let's check out our second example. We're probably going to spend the majority of our time talking about this. There is two cool things going on here. First of which is the kick. So this is a really standard kick, and I've chosen this one just because it kind of fit the bill on every single example. So our kick is going to actually remain the same. And that's the important thing to pass along to you here, is that it doesn't really matter what samples you're using. What I'm trying to illustrate is the techniques used with the samples and how they're trimmed or how they're treated. You can get these types of drum punchiness and these types of noises without spending money on a new sample pack. So you don't have to use Mr. Bill's samples, but you could if you wanted to. But you could basically use whatever drum samples are available to you that have the same sort of like sound to them. So check this out. This particular kick drum is just it's got a nice low end. It's got a nice high end, so that there's characteristics throughout the spectrum. That's really the most important thing here. So if I slap spectrum on this, so this is my default spectrum. If you ever use spectrum, by the way, you should always make sure that you've got it set to a range and not automatic. So the default on spectrum is for it to be like this, which is absolutely useless for comparing two different things, because all it does is resets itself every time you hit the space bar. But if you use automatic, which is let's see here, I think I had mine set up to 0 and -80 decibels. That's where I like to keep it. So it stays the same. So if I A/B this with another kick, you can see the difference between the two, and it's a fixed range. What's important to note here is that we're hitting a gentle sort of hump, right? So there's a nice, and if I wish I could zoom in on it, but you can kind of see how. So I'm trying to use words and it's also playing at the same time. You can kind of see how it's how it rolls down, you know. So it hits here, but then as the sample progresses, it sort of rolls backward. Here, watch. Does that make sense to you now? Mm-hmm. So you're hitting a nice like 60 hertz ish range, and then it rolls back down the spectrum. That's the frequency that thumps your chest. If you've ever been to a really loud EDM concert, and you've felt the kick in your chest, it's around 60 hertz. This right here is the second node. I call these nodes, right? It's these peaks of the spectrum. And again, it's going to be pretty much double the first node. So we've got, what is it? It peaks around like 40, 45. This is around like, or it should be like 90-ish. Interesting. Maybe I'm looking at the roll off instead of actually where it hits. So this is 130 hertz at this node. I would expect this to be more like 60-ish. Yeah, it is. It's like right around here. Anyway.
Gotcha.
So we've got a nice balanced spectrum throughout the kick, and it even has some high range content, which is that kind of click noise that you hear. You hear that click?
Mm-hmm.
That's really important. So make sure you've got a clicky kick. Yeah, I like it. Clicky kick. All right, so make sure you got a clicky kick. That's important for this. And these layered drums are just that. So there's no real huge amount of compression. It's just a good, tight mix of drum noises. And what we've got here, so that's our kick. It's just a simple kick, is a layered snare, okay? This is a great example of a layered snare that you've given me here. and I'm going to bring these in one at a time. There are a lot of artists that use this layered snare approach, most notably artists like deadmau5 and Adam Young of Owl City. He uses, oh my God, Owl City, their drums, he layers like, I'm telling you, 24 layers of just different noises to make kicks and snares. I'm not even joking. And they're teeny tiny noises all the way up through like him hitting the trailer with a hammer. Like you should watch this video on how to layer drums. It's my favorite tutorial on how to layer drums. So let's see here. Let's just go through. So one snare at a time. This is called a French snare. I'm going to get into why later because there's a specific example I want to talk about with this dude. This holy shit compression down here. We'll get there. So snare number 1. It's pretty nice. On its own, it's kind of thin. So what we're going to do is add a clap sort of snare sample. Now, you could also make this with a white noise generator and a sine wave. So if you had a sine wave going doon and you had a white noise generator going tsh, and you put those two together, it would sound like this. Do you hear the composite?
Yeah, I was actually just watching a video similar to that.
Okay. So that's how a quote-unquote French snare is made. Some people call it a glitch snare, IDM snare, pop snare. All those are similar types of snare drums, but they have longer and shorter releases. So your IDM glitch hop snares are going to be very tight, like, just a, and then your French snare is going to be a bit longer. So there's a long release on the sample. It occurs for more than just like a split second, right? It has a and you can zoom in, you can even see that it goes for a minute. You know what I'm saying? Right. Long release time. Then we're going to add another sound that is also a composite, but you could make this on your own. But for the sake of time here, I've sort of reduced it down to just this particular sample. So let's add this layer on top and see how that changes things. What has been added here is a degree of uncertainty about where the snare actually starts and some more sparkly sort of high range stuff. So again, I'm going to throw spectrum on this one. This is the French snare. You can see a real strong node here, around like 224 hertz. That's the tone, right? The doon, 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 that tone coming through. And the rest of this is all just white noise, basically. So you see how there's the sine wave, which clearly has a pitch, right? And then everything else, white noise, is very balanced. And then I'm going to throw a spectrum on the light snare clap sample down here and take a look at this spectrum and how different it is when you A-B these two. There's no tone in there, right? There's no hump. Let me go back to the French snare. See that hump? This one is a bit louder in terms of its characteristics in the higher range of the spectrum. So what we're doing here, and this is important also, instead of EQing another snare sample, what we're actually doing is just introducing an entirely new snare sample. So there's two different ways to look at sample selection and drum processing. If you're in the camp of someone like me, I choose, instead of EQing a noise, to just add another noise that contains the either boost or cut that I'm looking for. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So that's what's going on here. So we've got one snare which really, frankly, lacks a bit of high range. I'm going to play these again for you and bring them in. And then we have another sample that we're adding to it, which contains more sparkle in the high range and a degree of uncertainty because it has that sort of introductory sound to it. And even if we zoom in a bit, you can actually see this sample does start before this sample. Okay, so let's listen again. So, like I said, this one's more of a white noise sound, and this one's kind of a tearing noise. You hear what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So those together add a lot of texture, right? So this one right here is just for tone and punch. This one's for texture. Now this third one that we're gonna bring in is for splatter. All right, and I don't really know how else to describe it, but I've talked about this before when I do Deadmau5 tutorials, because he uses a splatter snare, and what that is it's a group of samples that are obscuring where the actual thing starts. And if you notice here, in order for me to get this correct, it's between bar lines. So I started off with it snapped to the narrow grid here, so it was snapped there. Then I turned the grid off and then dragged it just a little bit off, just a teeny bit off. And what that does is it creates phase. It creates a little bit of texture between the sound samples naturally, instead of having to add an effect to it or something like a chorus. So let me just Z that until it's back where it should be. And I'm going to add this one in so you can hear what difference this one makes. That one's a bit more subtle. That one's kind of hard to hear. So let me take off snare number 2 so you can hear just snare number 1 and the clap together, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now if I add the kick back in, here are your drums. There you go. Now, what they do in their song that's pretty unique is they add this tambourine sample. And then you see how I've exclamated, "Layer for excitement!" Because that's the purpose of this. It's just exciting. So if you add a tambourine sample to anything, it just immediately becomes that much more exciting. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this on after it rolls through once, just so you can hear how the second time through is 10 times more exciting.
Objectively more exciting.
Oh, this is kind of boring. I'm not feeling this. Ah, there it is. There it is. Right, so that's the tambourine. You can do the same thing with a ride cymbal. In fact, you can switch fours between the two if you want ultimate excitement. So a ride cymbal on the bell going tink tink tink. In fact, like Southern rock bands, I mean that's their bread and butter for getting the audience dancing, is just hitting the damn bell on the ride cymbal. So. Anyways, does this all make sense to you? No effects were used on these at all. I mean, Spectrum's on a couple, but this is all just natural layering. That's it. Just layering stuff together, making sure it's mixed down really good.
Gotcha.
Cool. All right. Close all this up. Turn it off. Cool. All right, we're going to go on to the Madeon holy shit compression, because that's really where he gets his signature sound from, is the kind of glue compression, just slamming the formants and the attacks out of these samples. Again, I'm only using this same kick that I used in the last example, plus the French snare sample that I used in the last example. So it looks simpler, but there's some cool stuff going on here in terms of how it's processed. So I'm just going to play it for you first, and then we'll get into how it's processed, all right?
Okay.
So that's the standard on the breakdown sort of sound. Now it's not going to sound as noisy or quite as limited as it's going to sound in his track, because the rest of the track isn't present here. Does that make sense? There's all these other things that are happening in terms of like frequency spectrum that are not represented here. This is just the drums. So we're not getting that gain reduction that we get on the master channel. We're not getting the compression that we're getting from the rest of the instruments also making noise on 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that's not present here, but we can get a sense of how he processes drums. You'll notice immediately that these drums are a lot more punchy than these drums. So let me A/B this for you, okay? going back to those drums, they sound a bit muted. They just don't punch as much, and there's a good reason for that. So if you look down here on the kick, let's start here. I'm gonna turn the snares off. Did you hear the muted nature of those other drums compared to these?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's striking. So the glue compressor in Ableton, do you have glue compressor?
Yes.
Okay. The glue compressor is one of the most just brilliant processing utilities for drums, and I did not use it enough until I saw another producer manipulate this thing correctly. And what it does is it's a clone of the solid state Logic board compressor, I think. So I think it's a clone of an SSL compressor. But basically what this thing does is it takes, well, it's a compressor, but it's quick. It's very snappy. It's got a characteristic sort of like crunch to you'll hear what I'm saying. It sounds different than other compressors. I'm having trouble describing why it's different, but what I'm going to do is actually put a new glue compressor on here. Whoops. I'm going to turn mine off, and I'm going to show you what I did, right? So this kick has been reset to its normal state. And what I'm going to do is turn the threshold down for the amount of compression down until I can see this needle just barely hit the peg over here. And then I'm going to turn the makeup up until it sounds as loud as I want it to. Okay? So I'm going to mute my mic here and show you how this works real time. All right, so that's hitting about negative 28. I like to round it. So I was negative 28.3, but I'm going to round it up to negative 28. And so next thing I'm going to do is turn my makeup up until it sounds as loud as I want. And I usually end up around 16. In fact, I normally just type in 14 and then go up or down depending on how that sounds. But if you go too far, you'll notice this little clip indicator tells you that you're clipping the sample. So there's two things you can do at that point. You can either turn the dry wet down, or you can turn the channel volume down. In this case, I've chosen just to turn the channel volume down, so I'm not blowing my audience's ears out. And then he just adds a teeny bit of gentle high shelf to get rid of the top end of it, because the rest of the tracks in the song would interfere if we left the top end in the kick drum. So let me turn this off, get back to my original glue, and I'll show you the A/B of glue on versus glue off. Okay?
Sure.
You hear how it just makes things a bit snappier? Like that's the best way I can describe what glue compression does. It just makes a sample snappy. It actually takes out a good amount of frequency in the mid range. So the whole mid range of this sample, and even I bet you if we put a spectrum on it, we can even see it. So here's a spectrum before the EQ with glue compression turned on versus off. Okay. It kept all the nice roll off and all the nice punch of the lowest lowest node of the noise. But you see how when I turned glue compression on, it just drops this area out entirely.
Yeah.
You
put emphasis on the node.
Exactly. It puts emphasis on the attack, right? That's where it gets the snappy nature, and then it immediately backs the sound off. So that's where that's like a snap. A snap is only attack. There's no release on a snap. It's just, you know what I'm saying? So that's why it sounds snappy. And then, yeah, again, just a little bit more reduction of the upper frequencies here. So I did the exact same thing with the snare in terms of processing. I started by turning the threshold down until the needle was hitting the peg, and then turning the makeup up. And coincidentally, 16 decibels turned out to be the correct setting. The same here. So both of these have been turned down. But you see the threshold here is a bit lower. It's -30 instead of -28. So there are different samples for sure. Chose again to leave dry, wet, and range completely wide open and just turn down the channel volume. But there's some different things I did to the leftmost section, and I want to talk about that. So here, I left everything by default, right? Ratio 4, release 0.6, attack 1. What does all that mean? That means how quickly the compressor is going to act on the signal, okay? So I actually chose to turn the attack down a bit so it doesn't actually compress the very beginning of the sound quite as much. I set the release to automatic just because it sounds good that way on this particular sample. Tested all the settings, of course. This one sounds the best to my ears. And then turn the ratio down to 2 so it would be a little bit more blown out. I'm going to show you now the snare on its own, and then I'll turn glue on. And what that does is it increases the amount of release on the sample, and it gives you more of the white noise characteristic and less of the initial boop tone. And again, let's throw spectrum on it just so we can confirm that our ears are hearing what they're hearing. We'll start with glue off and then turn glue on. There's not a whole lot of noticeable difference between those two in terms of the way the spectrum looks, but you can definitely hear a difference, which is interesting. So, and then I added one more thing down here, and this is something that he does in like every song. On the turnarounds for the eight bars, or eight kicks, there'll be a reverse of the original snare sample, just so it kind of glides into each other. It sounds like this. Right? That's all it is. So you just grab this sample and you hit R in Ableton, that reverses it, and then you just kind of slide it around until it sounds good. There you go.
Gotcha.
So that's just the reverse of that. And that's how the samples themselves are treated. Now, there's another layer of compression that he adds to the entire drums as a bus. Now, I don't know this for a fact. This is just how I was able to recreate the noise. So if I turn everything back on here, there's an additional layer of compression. I'm using drum bus in Ableton. It's been my latest obsession in terms of plugins in this awesome program. So let's listen to it without, and then I'll turn the drum bus on. So the kick is actually pretty weak in terms of its mix as compared to the snare. And then the way you're able to bring that out in the final mix is by compressing the both of them as if they're a drum set. There is a lot more snare in his mix than kick for sure. But I think that's because a lot of his music is going to be played on systems that are in mono. And so you're not going to get a lot of bass range out of, like, an iPhone speaker or earbuds or... you know what I'm saying? Like, it's just not going to come across very well. He writes very poppy music, and this is very typical of pop music as well. This is definitely a mixing technique, I would say, is akin to pop stuff. So that's pretty cool. If you were doing more of like an EDM banger, right, something you'd hear, you definitely would mix your kick a little bit louder, but there would also probably be sub-range. So... if we're getting into how to make the track, I'd probably turn the kick up just maybe 2 or 3 dB and then add a sub track to it or add some sort of a bass synthesizer to it, and then mix those with the kick. But as it, just on their own, this is how I was able to recreate it.
Gotcha.
Any questions about this?
No. And
Okay.
I see what you're saying. It would sound different in the mix. doesn't quite sound the same.
Say that again?
Just the drum. It would sound different in the mix, but it sounds different. It's just on its own.
Yeah, no, it definitely sounds different in the mix. And that's because you've got all these extra frequencies that are colliding with what's happening. And then there's a compressor on the master track. And it does different things depending on what's being played through it, right? And so if you're playing an entire track through a compressor, it's going to duck things differently than if you're just playing drums through it. That's kind of what's going on here.
Right.
So that's neat. All right, let's take a look at ninth parallel, because the only real difference between these two is the addition of, in terms of sample selection, is the addition of a gated sort of reverb snare, which I'm going to turn off. So it is, it's currently off. Okay, good. Listen to this. It's the same thing we were just listening to, basically. If I turn my limiters off, and we'll get to why those are there in a minute. So here we go. Well, hold on. There we go. It's the same thing. But there's this additional sort of, I call it Phil Collins because he's the guy, along with Peter Gabriel, that invented this technique. It's a gated reverberation. So check this out. I'm going to play just this channel. The difference between these two, again, is this Phil Collins or gated reverb. Gated reverb track is the difference. And what a gated reverb is it's a reverb with a compressor beforehand and a gate afterward. And all you're capturing is the tail end of a noise. It's if you think about the song "In the Air Tonight" by Phil Collins and Peter Gabriel, you know, do 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 do, those drums. That's a gated reverb. There's actually an accident how that sound came to be. It's a pretty cool YouTube video on it, actually, by Vox, which I don't normally promote their content, but it's a good video. So we've got the French snares from these two channels. It's just a duplicate of these two channels in a group. And the group is only sending audio to the send channel. Do you know about send and returns and how that works?
No.
Okay. So sends and returns are sort of a dinosaur of the age where effects were outboard and you had to use a mixer board, like a hardware audio mixing board, in order to get a good mix with a band that was in the studio. So instead of being able to just throw effects on a channel, like, because you and me can do this, we can just go Spectrum, tuner, ping pong, whatever. Like, we can throw whatever we want on a channel. Back in the day, you couldn't do that because there wasn't any computers, and they had these big racks of effects, and the board had what was called a send return. So you could send a duplicate of the audio to a return channel, and that would return the audio back to the board. So basically, you would only have a few of these, right? Some really fancy boards would have a bunch. But how much money you paid for your board kind of determined how many sends you had. So in this case, that's the technique we're using, because that's what they would have done. So they had a lexicon reverb set to a specific setting, a module, on a different part of the studio wall. And they had a cable between the two, and they were sending signal from Phil Collins' drums to the lexicon, and then that was getting returned back to the board, and they were recording that on top of the actual drums that they were actually recording. Does that make sense? So you get 4 channels of audio. You get kick, snare, and then gated reverb, right? Because it's sending out to these return tracks, and that's returning the affected signal back to the mix. So gotcha. All you need to know for send return is that this knob sends audio to here. There you go. That's the explanation. Okay. This knob, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So let's turn off these and just get a dry signal. And there's different settings here. So audio 2, by default, this would be the compressed group. So like by default, this would send to the compressed group in terms of where the audio is going in Ableton, like routing. But I've told it to give me sends only. So all we're getting is the amount of reverb we're applying to it. So let's listen to this. You can see as I increase the knob, the volume gets louder, and also the reverb channel, right, B here, is starting to see audio. So if I duck this all the way, all of a sudden B isn't giving us any audio, and we can't hear anything because the only audio we're going to get is the send. And that channel is just going straight to the master. So it's mixing this into the master channel in addition to these other channels that we already have, right? We're duplicating the audio basically. So now let me start turning things on this send channel so you can hear what I want it to do. First thing we're going to do is compress it a little bit. Then we're going to add some reverb to it. Then we're going to gate that reverb so we only get a little bit of it. Cool. Now I'm going to unsolo it, and I'm going to add it to what we were already listening to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, gotcha.
Cool. So that's a really cool technique. I'm actually gonna call this and get rid of the parallel compressor. I'm not using it. Cool. There we go. So that is a good way to get punch and reverb out of drums. Now there's something else that Ninth Parallel is doing. And actually, before I get rid of the parallel reverb channel, parallel comp, let me explain what that is. In addition to this, because I might be able to get away with using that instead of these limiters. I don't like this technique. So this is a bad mixing technique that a lot of people do because they're lazy. And what it does is it increases the gain of an audio signal without it peaking. That's what a limiter does. Now, used correctly on vocals, for gain reduction, you get these really beautiful sort of crispy vocals. Used incorrectly, you get that sort of peaked out dubstep from 2010 sound. But there are artists who use it quote unquote incorrectly as a stylistic choice. For instance, Carpenter Brute slams everything through a limiter and just brick walls the hell out of it, and it works for him because that's his style. So again, good and bad things you can do with the limiter. But I'm about to show you something I think is a bad thing. If you disagree with me, let me know in the comments down below. I won't read it. Here we go. And all we're doing is extracting dynamic range. We're just removing dynamic range so that the entirety of the drums mix is just very slammed, very loud, very punchy, okay?
But isn't dynamic range like your favorite thing?
I do like dynamic range quite a lot. But with certain things, like I've been learning this recently, especially vocals, dynamic range in vocals doesn't come across very well unless you have a very thin instrumentation. So for instance, a jazz quintet. So if Esperanza Spalding was recording an album, she would use a microphone that has a tube compressor in it, and she would make sure that the dynamic range of her entire voice was going to come across in the mix, because there's only going to be her bass, her voice, a drum kit, and maybe one other instrument. You know what I'm saying? Like a very minimal sort of instrumentation. Dynamic range is great because there isn't a lot of things to get in the way. But when your instrumentation gets really thick, like for instance on a pop song like Bruno Mars, like 24 Karat Magic, there's very little dynamic range in his vocals on that channel. On that track. Because it has to stay at a constant volume in order to compete with the rest of the instrumentation that is also at a constant volume. So in certain instances, reducing dynamic range is a good thing. There's a really cool plugin out there called Gain Reduction Pro by Joey Sturgis Sound, and it's pretty top notch. I've been messing with it recently, at least the demo. I can say that I like it, but that's all it does is it just reduces dynamic range. It's just gain reduction, taking away the amount of difference between the loudest and softest tones of a particular sample. Let's see here. What I want to tell you real quick, just an aside before I quit recording, if I turn off these limiters, I wonder if I can get away with compressing this to the same punchiness using parallel compression. That might open up an entire different conversation. So hold on a second here.
Sure.
Okay, yes, I can. And that's a lot of parallel compression, by the way. I never go that far up the knob. I normally only do like 10-15% at max. But what I'm doing here is the same send return technique that we were talking about with the Phil Collins reverb, except that I'm sending an entire mix of the drums to a parallel compressor using a New York style compressor. And this is something I grabbed from a Mr. Bill tutorial from years ago. What it's doing is it's taking the very lowest and very highest frequencies of the drums mix and absolutely fucking crushing them through a compressor. Let me show you what that sounds like by itself. So it's removing the dynamic range from the drums, but in a way that isn't actually, it's not taking anything away from the mix. That's why it's called parallel compression, because we're compressing it alongside of our clean signal. This is probably my favorite way to do, dynamic range reduction with drums. And I recommend that everybody take a look at Mr. Bill's tutorial on parallel compression. It's definitely the best. And I'm not just being a fanboy. I mean it. I use it practically. Cool. What time is it? Man, time just fucking flies by.
Jeez. That was an hour?
I mean, it was 52 minutes. I'm going to do a quick sign off real quick. But we're definitely not done talking. Give me just a moment to do a sign off. All right, everybody. This is a very special episode. Thanks again to Eli for letting me record this. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. And if you're interested in taking a private lesson with me, if you want to do how to make just like this, one-on-one, hit me up via email. It's in the About section on my YouTube page. Or my favorite way to do lessons is to subscribe through Patreon. It's $45 a month. You get 1 hour with me per month, one private how to make per month. It doesn't have to just be on drums. I can do any other types of stuff. Like, what else have we done, Eli? We did chord structure one time. We did like side chaining, with certain songs and anyway.
We've also gone over track.
Yeah, exactly. Like sometimes we just go over entire tracks, like what are the elements of this track that make it what it is, right? Or a specific artist. I think we had just an entire power hour one time on Madeon, didn't we?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was good, but we learned the characteristics of his sound, like what makes him him. So that sort of thing. But in addition to that, if you sign up on Patreon, you also get all of my sample packs and all of my project files immediately, plus the benefit of receiving a copy of both the Dr. Smooth EP and other stuff I've released as well. So many benefits for that. Also, in the near future, I will be teaching through Live Producers Online. If you've never been to their website, you need to check that out. But that deal, I haven't signed the papers yet, but Dan and I have definitely had several handshakes on it. So I will be teaching through their website, which I'm looking forward to as well. So either way, if you want an hour with me, that's how you do it. I also do it a la carte. If you'd rather do like several weeks in a row, you don't really want to wait an entire month, that's fine too. But just let me know. I'm available to teach. It's my favorite thing to do. Yeah, I guess have a nice day. Gardner signing off. You want to say goodbye, Eli?
Bye-bye.
Thanks.